Good evening. I'm Brenda Schufelt. I'm the History Room Coordinator for the Hudson Area Library, and I want to welcome you to our local history talk this month, People of Courage, People of Hope, Seekers of Justice, the Underground Railroad Revisited, with Paul and Mary Liz Stewart of the Underground Railroad Education Center in Albany. So I'm a big fan of theirs and their organization. I first heard Mary Liz and Paul speak 6 years ago, and I think it's wonderful because not only have they done the research on this particular area of the capital region, but they've also usually share how they did their research during their talk. So that's always fascinating. And I know a lot of us are historians and history buffs, so I'm sure we'll be learning a lot. They will also speak about their organization, the Underground Railroad Education Center, and their important work engaging youth in history and also restoring the residents of a major conductor of the Underground Railroad in Albany. So I'll tell you a little bit about the history room of the Hudson Area Library. We are dedicated to preserving and making accessible to the public the history of Hudson, Stockport, and Greenport. And part of that is that we've been scanning many documents and texts that we have that have historic value, including the City of Hudson directories that we've just started putting up online. The earliest one is 1851, and you will see those on our website. So you're welcome to go through them. They're a treasure trove of the history of Hudson, including occupations and the people that lived there and advertising businesses, how industry changed and developed. And also right now the history room is generally closed to the public at this time, but we do have an online research request form that you can fill out on our website and for any local history. It's a free service that the library offers to the public. And we also have limited appointments for research that would be available. So you can call the library or you can email me. And that information again is on hudsonAreaLibrary.org. Anyone wishing to donate to the library's history room, you can visit the website and go to our history room page where there's a donate button specifically for funds to go to the history room. And anyone wishing to donate to the Underground Railroad Education Center, you can go to their website and there's a form that you can fill out to donate. So we generally have about 10 local history talks throughout the year. So stay tuned for the spring talks that are coming up. The one announcement I have of an event is this Saturday at 11:25 a.m. You can see our Hudson Area Library History Room team in their vintage bathing costumes at the Oakdale Plunge 2021. So it's being live streamed. They can't have a crowd on the beach, but you're going to watch us jump into the Oakdale Lake after they break the ice. And this program is a fundraiser for the Friends of Hudson Youth, which the History Room collaborates with actually, especially during the Oakdale Summer Camp, and the Hudson Water Rescue and Dive Team. It's a wonderful event. It's a lot of fun. It's cold, but so if you'd like to view this or join us, if you just Google Oakdale Plunge 2021, the first result should be the registration page and you can get all the information you need. And I also want to say we have several books on the Underground Railroad, specifically in upstate New York, in our library collection. And you can go online or call to check out those books and make appointments to pick them up. And currently in the library, patrons you can make appointments to come into the library to browse and find books and to go on the computer. So we've opened up that. So for tonight's event, Paul and Mary Liz Stewart are independent researchers and scholars in residence at Russell Sage College. We originally collaborated with them before on a project on suffrage and abolition in upstate New York with Gail Wheeler and her group from the Poetry Center from Hudson High School. And it was a wonderful collaboration. The zine of the students' work is also on our website on the History Room page. After their talk, a question and answer period will follow. We will be recording the event tonight and most likely making it available on our YouTube channel. And I will email that link automatically to everyone who has registered for tonight's event. So welcome. And now I'll turn it over to Mary Liz and Paul Stewart from the Underground Railroad Education Center.
Yes, a little bit of confusion because about a year ago, we renamed it the Underground Railroad Education Center, and it was Underground Railroad History Project. Actually, the Underground Railroad History Project of the Capital Region Incorporated Corporation got a DBA, corporate DBA. And so at any rate, that's where, yeah.
So we still stumble over it ourselves. But thank you, Brenda, very much for inviting us to share this evening, something that's very near and dear to our hearts. And we hope that the time we spend together will be well spent, be considered well spent by those who are participating with us this evening. Do we have our share screen? We're gonna share a PowerPoint with you. We always figure that the PowerPoint slides are more attractive to look at than we are, so we'll jump right in and get started. Perhaps to put us in context, Paul and I started our personal research project back in the late 1990s, and we were quite committed to finding stories about local Albany residents who were involved in the Underground Railroad. The purpose then being that Paul would take the stories and write about them in a local community newspaper for which he was volunteering. I was going to take these stories into my classroom to help my tangible 10-year-old thinkers understand more effectively that the Underground Railroad was about people and network as opposed to above ground trains and subways. Well, as we dug into historic documents, and at this point, I really have to give a shout out to our local public librarians. They were so significant in helping us to connect with historic documents. Paul and I, both working full time, didn't have the luxury of moving from one repository to another. So with the help of our local public librarians through their network, they accessed historic documents and brought them to us. And it was an incredible contribution to our work because we were able then to read period newspapers and broadsides and letters and other documents that just brought forward voices of people who'd been written out of this history and accounts of Underground Railroad activism that were very different than the standard retelling.
Yeah, I remember early on we used interlibrary loan a great deal, and they would actually photocopy documents at some library in Long Island and send them to the library in Albany, and we'd get a chance to look at them. So that's great.
And I'll betray our age here, but for those of you who are gray hairs like us, you'll remember the days of microfilm.
Yes.
There were no computers when we started, so we, or at least computers publicly available. So microfilm, we had lots of dates with microfilm machines. But since that time, we have continued this journey. And what we did, just to back up for a moment too, when we were encountering these stories, voices and stories of people who had been written out of this history, they were local residents. And so we decided that what we were uncovering was by rights belong to the community. And so that's what helped, that's what motivated us to take a turn in our work, and life's never been the same since, but it's been a great journey along the way. And so from the research that we started 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, and have continued through time, we share with you the Underground Railroad Revisited this evening.
Yes. Now, the image that you see on your screen right now, the idea of people of courage, people of hope, seekers of justice, this is what we had a sense that was a better representation of the general drift of the story of the Underground Railroad than some other things that we had heard. The image that you see there on your screen is from William Still's book, The Underground Railroad. William Still was one of the, really was the key person in Philadelphia through the late 1840s, I guess, and 1850s, who welcomed people on behalf of the Vigilance Committee of Philadelphia and operated the office there where people were helped from. So he wrote a collection of stories. He put together a collection of stories based on his personal interviews with people who had traveled on the Underground Railroad and who had come to the Philadelphia station of the Underground Railroad. And he took that material from his notes, which he had hidden in a cemetery crypt immediately after the Civil War, because there was concern on the part of many people who had been involved in the Underground Railroad whether or not there would be prosecutions for the work that they had done. But he was able to bring that out, put together a book. The book is really a classic in terms of understanding the Underground Railroad. So let's press on here.
Mm-hmm. There we go.
Okay.
Can you X out? Can you X? Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
So one of the things that has happened for us as we explored the story of the Underground Railroad was that we found out there were a number of key ideas that helped us interpret once we had started looking at things, we sort of were able to put things into boxes, and it helped us understand the Underground Railroad a little bit better, and it was a little bit better in terms of analyzing it. These boxes are, of course, that it can be understood as a document-based story. The real stories are better than the myths, and we'll go through all of this and explain what we mean by this. That has a public side, that it's not just a string of safe houses, but it really is a movement that African Americans, not just as the passengers of the Underground Railroad, but as the leadership of the Underground Railroad, played a role. It was civil disobedience and resistance to federal laws and to slavery, the enslavement of people. The language we use is important, and these stories from the past have a connection with us today. So we're gonna walk through these concepts and show you some people, documents, and tell you some stories that hopefully will help you better understand the Underground Railroad, broadly speaking, in our region. So this idea of document-based, when we first started exploring the Underground Railroad, one of the things that we were often told was there weren't any documents to be explored. And in fact, one of the scholars who dominated the Underground Railroad studies for a good 20-25 years was Larry Guerra, who published a book in 1960 called The Liberty Line. And part of what he did was he set up an idea. He said, this is the Underground Railroad. I think this is the Underground Railroad. Let me see if I can find documentation that supports this idea. And he found it difficult to find the documentation based on what he had put up as an idea. And the result of that was, he said, there's very little documentation, and maybe the Underground Railroad didn't exist at all. So we, rather than setting up an idea and then trying to find the documents to support it, we said, let the documents speak for themselves. So there are a lot of documents that have been associated with the Underground Railroad, or said to be connected with the Underground Railroad. What do these documents say about the Underground Railroad itself? And that has been a very fruitful way to approach the story. In fact, that's also been a fruitful way to approach this idea of finding places. And I'm kind of getting off into the weeds here, but a lot of times people will say, oh, I have a house. I wonder if this house was on the Underground Railroad. Instead of doing it that way, go find some abolitionist literature where they talk about doing things that were the Underground Railroad, and ask, where did these things happen? And kind of start from there. So at any rate, we've got a document here. We're going to share with you a few documents. We're going to share with you, which I think you'll find very interesting.
This particular document that you're looking at is a copy of the handwritten letter that was written in 1860 by Harriet Myers. Harriet Myers, wife of Stephen Myers, both of whom, although Stephen tends to get the public acknowledgement, Stephen and Harriet were central activists on the Underground Railroad, or in the Underground Railroad movement in the capital region. But also because of the work that Stephen did that addressed other civil rights issues as well, he was very broadly connected around the state with other activists in other states around New York State, and he even had some connections in Canada. So a man who was, as I say, he was someone who had a broad reach, but very little public acknowledgement for what he did. And his wife, Harriet, worked alongside him, but as is typical for this period, the coverage of women's work, women's engagement is really quite limited. And so this particular letter that I will read to you in a moment is one that we really treasure, because it allows us not only to hear about Underground Railroad activism from the perspective of a date of 1860. We're nearing the Civil War at this point, and traditionally, the standard canon suggests to us that New York State was a safe haven, a wonderful place for people to come who had escaped enslavement. And Harriet, in her letter, tells a slightly different story. So let me share it with you. It also is significant in terms of shedding some light on and opening a door to understanding the activism of women in this period. So Harriet writes to Mr. William J. Esquire, Sir. Now, this is the grandson of John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice and one of the inaugural organizers of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. So this William J. is, a member of a very prominent New York family, a very wealthy New York family, and a civilly conscious family as well. So Harriet writes, Mr. William J. Esquire, Sir. The two fugitives arrived here that you sent, and I sent them immediately on their route for Canada. In this month, we have had 10. We have sent on the two that you sent, sir. They had some money. They said that you gave them some. They had enough to get to Canada, but the other had none. Mr. Myers is not home. He is at Lake George this season as a butler. And you see, sir, I have to attend to the fugitives myself. I was very thankful that you gave some aid, for it was on Saturday they came. And it would have been difficult to get money to send them on that day. And it is hard to get money for the fugitives, for it seems that prejudice against our class grows stronger every day. And yet we have a few good friends that feel for the bleeding slave that comes panting at their doors. I thank you for all the favors you have done for the downtrodden that come to this office. May God bless you, sir, and your posterity. Yours for the oppressed, Harriet Myers. Now, if we were in person, I would ask you what jumps off the page at you, what moves you, what surprises you. But in light of our virtual connection, what I'd like to do is simply share a few things with you that have been shared with us when we have shared this letter in person with others. One of the things that is oftentimes mentioned is that it is Harriet who welcomes these freedom seekers into her home. Typically, in this antebellum time period, this is unacceptable for women to do. There is no man at home in the house, so she should not be allowing these unknown people into her home, and yet she does. She interviews them in order to determine what their needs are. Then she takes that the next step and proceeds to obtain the resources necessary to meet the needs of these freedom seekers. She acknowledges that the J family has been providing support over time, both financial support as well as directing freedom seekers to her and to Stephen. She notes that Stephen is working at Lake George as a butler, reminding us that all of these activists, they had jobs that were necessary to support themselves. Some of them were parents and husbands and wives. There were children involved to be tended to. There were homes to take care of. So while these were individuals who were focused in on their Underground Railroad activism, they were also leading very full lives, just as we do today, with multiple aspects. And yet they continued to pursue. And actually, when we think about it, when Harriet opened that front door to invite the freedom seekers in her home, she was breaking state and federal laws, but felt that it was necessary to do in order to reach a greater good.
So there's a lot that we can really cull from this letter, but we're gonna press on because time is limited. It'd be nice to just kind of go through the whole progression of events that were running up to the Civil War that Harriet was no doubt thinking about.
What I would say is, if anyone is interested in coming to the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence here in Albany, the original Harriet's Letter is on display as part of an exhibit on the second floor of the Myers residence. So we'd welcome you to come.
And it'll be here through August.
Yeah.
So of this year. So
more documents.
Yeah. So this is a copy of the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate newspaper, a newspaper that Stephen Myers was involved in producing. He wound up doing the principal work for it. He was the agent for the newspaper. It was a newspaper that focused on temperance, self-help, and education. And it was really started by the key members of the Northern Star Association, which was in the 1840s, an African-American based group that was working similar to the Vigilance Committee of New York. And I would mention that John Stewart was one of the people not related to me, Stephen Myers, and Martin Cross, who was a temperance activist in Hudson. So I think that this newspaper is a great artifact from the period. And in fact, in some of the issues of this newspaper, Stephen Myers talks about the work that he was doing in terms of the Underground Railroad. One of the other issues, he goes at length, he's kind of responding to another newspaper's criticism, and he speaks at length about him having started as early as 1831 to assist freedom seekers here in Albany, and he goes on to talk about it. Other documents that can be helpful, there are many books from the period. There are many first-person narratives. I'm trying to think of the Fugitive Blacksmith.
J.W.C. Pennington?
By J.W.C. Pennington, another great read. But these are two that we're offering here as examples: Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave, and Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, with the help of Lydia Maria Child.
If anyone's interested in investigating these or others, of course, both Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and 12 Years a Slave are available to us in book form. And certainly the movie 12 Years a Slave, a very well done visual illustration of Solomon Northup's narrative. So the integrity of Solomon Northup's narrative is retained very well in that movie version. But additionally, a website called Doc South is one that has been very significant in digitizing many of these types of documents and making them available. So if you're interested, Doc South is certainly a good place to go.
Yes, they're available for free on Doc South, so you can read them. Of course, it's not as nice as holding a book in your hand and thumbing through the pages. I would like to point out the image of Solomon Northup on the cover of the book is often used to represent him. There's another image inside the book of him in a suit. So
very dapperly dressed.
Yeah.
Another one of our principles that we arrived at after grappling with various historic documents related to this time period is that of myth versus history. And while myth in and of itself is not false or erroneous, oftentimes, as we describe it, myth focuses in on a certain element which over time, a certain element of a story, which over time ends up getting exaggerated.
Yeah, exaggerated or enlarged.
Yeah, somehow big, bigger than life. And so, and then of course, those become popular popular tools to hang our knowledge on. And they sometimes squeeze out the reality. So we'd like to offer a few alternative ways of understanding this history.
Yeah, and I like to when I think about this idea of myth, I often think about the kid who went fishing with his father and caught a fish as big as his hand, and then when he got to be 35, his hand was bigger, and so he still remembers the fish that way, and so that's myth. So when people think about the Underground Railroad, they often think about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, two people who did incredible work and important work in terms of the Underground Railroad. But of course, Frederick Douglass had a great paper trail, both for the newspapers that he wrote and what people wrote about him. Harriet Tubman also had a great paper trail, quite interestingly, even though she was not a literate person. Sarah Bradford wrote a book comprising Harriet Tubman's experiences called Harriet Tubman, the Moses of Her People. And there was a congressional testimony that Harriet Tubman had to give in order to lobby for a pension for herself or for her husband who had fought in the Civil War. And then there were some major stories that were written about her in the Boston newspapers. So there was a bit of a paper trail there as well. But for so many people who were involved in the Underground Railroad, there was not the same kind of paper trail. Wilbur Siebert, who wrote a book called The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom, he wrote it, published it around 1898. For many years, it was the major work on the Underground Railroad. He had a big section in his book on Harriet Tubman as well. But he had projected that as many as 500 people across the country did work similar to what Harriet Tubman did. Most of those people, we have little idea of who they were or what they were doing, but there were many others who were notable in terms of that kind of work. So we have many local figures who we have been working on piecing together their stories.
And the stories, as we have uncovered them, have been pieces, much like pieces of a puzzle, so that the stories are not necessarily complete. But what we decided to do a few years in was to say, well, we have sufficient enough pieces to begin to share the story. And what's really been very nice about doing this work in New York State is that people who've been researching their own communities' stories, as they have encountered information about folks that we're interested in, they will share with us and we in turn with them. So it's really been a wonderful collaborative effort in building the story and expanding our understanding of the work of these activists. The gentleman on the top left with the mustache in bald head, that's Dr. Thomas Elkins, one of the local abolitionists in the city of Albany, who in his adult life began his career as a dentist, as an apothecary, then continued studies, became a dentist, and then finally became a medical doctor and provided his services to freedom seekers and others in the city of Albany. Moving over to let's move down to the bottom below Dr. Thomas Elkins, again, gentleman with bald head, lots of bald heads here in this collection, but very nice facial whiskers there and suit. That's Moses Viney. Some of you may know him in relation to the city of Schenectady. Did you want to say a little something about him quickly?
He continued his work. He escaped from slavery, I think in the 1840s, was active in Schenectady, decided to settle in Schenectady and became a coach taxi driver after the Civil War. Money was left to him from one of his employers. And he continued that work into the early 20th century.
Sarah Johnson, who is to the right of Moses Viney, is a special image for us because we've had a difficult time finding visual images of women. And she was one of the colleagues of Harriet Myers and other women of the mid-19th century who did put their energies together to address issues of injustice and strategize among themselves in ways that they could work to abolish the institution of slavery. Continuing on to the right, the gentleman in the top hat is James Beulah. He and his wife and children escaped enslavement from Maryland.
Yes.
Maryland, and across a number of weeks, they made their way to Albany, New York, decided to settle here in Albany, and had a home on Lydia Street, which is today's Madison Avenue, for those of you who have some familiarity with Albany streets. They stayed here for a period of about 5 years, but James Beulah was considered valuable enough that bounty hunters were sent to pursue him. So he and his wife and children dropped everything they had here, moved themselves to safety in central New York State, spent another 4 to 5 years in central New York State, and then the same thing happened again. They were pursued again. So they chose to seek sanctuary in Canada, and following the Civil War, they chose to return to central New York State, where they lived out their lives.
And the next man to the, I'm not sure if that's to the right or to the left.
To the right.
My right, at any rate, might be your left, was that, is Henry Highland Garnett, who served as a minister in the city of Troy throughout most of the 1840s.
And we'll say a little bit more about him in a few minutes.
Right, and above him is Reverend Nathaniel Paul, who was pastor of the African Baptist Church in Albany. And you mentioned the man with the whiskers, right?
No, I didn't mention
the man with
him
the
yet.
whiskers is William Henry Johnson. Again, an interesting fellow who wrote an autobiography that was published in 1900, out of which we were able to retrieve a number of pictures of individuals from the period.
And William Henry Johnson actually was born free in Virginia, and at the age of 13 left home to become a barber. Interestingly, we always joke about the hair moving from the top of his head down to his, lower down on his face. But he was very well regarded as a barber here in the city of Albany, and chose to settle in Albany in order to work alongside of Stephen Myers, the man who is seated in the center. And we'll save our explanation of him until we get a little further along. In the very last image, top right, it's a drawing of a man with a scroll in his hand. That's the only image we have of Abel Brown, who was a white Baptist minister, who again settled in Albany, and for the purpose of working on Underground Railroad activism through his residence here.
Yeah.
So, and there are many others, some for whom we only have names because there are no images, but this is a sampling of folks who were involved.
And in terms of our exploring of the story, we actually have accumulated a list of about 130 individuals who were passengers on the Underground Railroad, and little bits of story about them. And it would be great to just dedicate one whole talk to that group of people, but we're going to press on because we have time.
We like to share this image, and I'll try and be brief here, but the shackles and the collar are representative of that standard retelling that focuses very much on the Underground Railroad being about abolitionists offering assistance to escaped slaves or runaways to assist them to find freedom. Well, that was part of the story, but what we found in our research was that for Black abolitionists, there was much more going on, in that for them, at the heart of what they were doing and informing their strategies was this desire to see in real time the promises maintained in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence as being equitably available to every person in this country. And so what that resulted in for our Black abolitionists was that, yes, at the top of their agenda would be how to strategize to abolish the institution of slavery and assist freedom seekers. But at the same time, they understood that there was a bigger civil rights issue, a bigger set of civil rights issues that needed to be addressed as well. Because even when people of color were able to obtain their freedom, they still had to find housing, they had to find jobs, they were interested in education, they were interested in voting and expressing themselves within the public arena. And yet these were areas within which the prohibitions and constrictions were imposed. And so our Black abolitionists also took their Underground Railroad activism and broadened it to a civil rights activism in these other areas as well.
We include this map. It was a map, an early theme study map from the National Park Service, because it's illustrative of some aspects of the story that often don't get talked about. Everybody knows the Underground Railroad was about people escaping from enslavement, Black people escaping from enslavement in the South and making their way to the North and Canada. And that's what's illustrated in this map. But there are some other arrows I want to draw your attention to. In the lower left-hand corner, arrows coming out of Texas, going into Mexico, and in the lower right-hand corner, arrows coming out of Georgia, North Florida, et cetera, going into the Caribbean. This also is a part of the story of the Underground Railroad. If we're talking about people escaping from enslavement and making their way to freedom, that's what this is. Now, fortunately, or rather unfortunately, that these aspects of the story have not been well studied. And only just now are we beginning to see more literature come out to talk about this. It's been a little bit difficult, I think, in the in the Texas border area to identify out who the people were who were involved in assisting people who were traveling to make their way to freedom. It has been long known that there are communities in northern Mexico, Afro-Mexican communities, but the Mexicans don't count them that way. They just count them as more Mexicans. And of course, in the Caribbean, people who escaped and went to the Bahamas or even to Cuba and some of the other islands in the Caribbean, again, those stories. Now, one of the other elements in this complexity is that some of the stories might well have been, that would have been written about these people and their journeys might well have been written in Spanish or in French in some cases. So, or the people are absorbed into the Bahamian and UK British world. So we don't know about them in quite the same way, but people are beginning to look at these stories now.
One last element to the myth versus history principle is that that the history is in our backyards. And just to highlight this quickly so we can respect the time that we have with you, there is an organization in New York State called Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, which has been working to bring together the number of researched sites with it that are located all around New York State that have been working, where people have been working to both continue the research and preserve this history and preserve the tangible artifacts related to this developing story. Can we move on to the really
Yeah, I just want to spend a minute with this slide. This document called the Vigilance Committee Office flyer is an important one. It's the one that helped us identify the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. The place where Stephen and Harriet lived in the mid-1850s was a building that was in terrible shape and that we were able to work on restoring. Our organization bought the building for $1,500, and we've since put more than $1 million into the restoration.
And we're not done yet.
And we're not done yet. So that includes gutters and downspouts, restoration of all the windows, chimneys, major work in the back of the building and inside the building. So there's lots more there. The secrecy of the Underground Railroad has often been the part that has been played up a great deal. And we'd like to give witness to the idea of the public side of the Underground Railroad. As a matter of fact, that flyer that I just showed you is also a witness to the public side of the Underground Railroad, because
That's right.
I know, but it's there too.
It's
okay,
coming.
well, it's coming. Okay, so these are signers of the Eastern New York Anti-Slavery Society. One of the things that happened a lot in the period before the Civil War in terms of the Underground Railroad was that many times their stories got into the newspapers, the regular newspapers as well as the abolition newspapers, and there was discussion of them. So even in spite of the fact that there were secrets, oftentimes there were things that were public. In this case, from the Tocsin of Liberty newspaper, the call for the organization of the Eastern New York Anti-Slavery Society. And you can see some folks from Kinderhook, Hudson, and Valatia, were signers in that. It was announced in the newspaper, so to speak. This document, of course, as I mentioned, tells us a lot about the Underground Railroad. And when you think about the kind of secrecy, I mean, yes, I'm sure there were secrets. They didn't tell you specifically. In this case, there's 287 people that they're referencing that they helped over a 10-month period. They didn't necessarily tell you when those people were coming. There is a story at the bottom that specifically talks about a group of 16 that came on a specific date. But again, this was a fundraising flyer,
And as a flyer, it would have been distributed with one of the next
Right.
one. As a flyer, it would have been distributed as we would distribute flyers today. This slide gives you an example of some of the abolition newspapers of the period that were a significant communication tool, both among those who were anti-slavery in their sentiments, but also these became an educational tool for the general public, an opportunity for the general public to learn about the realities that were being, if you will, being denied by the pro-slavery forces. So there always was a struggle on the part of the newspapers for sustaining the supporting the costs that were part of the publication process, but yet it was quite a dedicated effort on the part of many to produce these printed documents for members of the community.
So this idea of the Underground Railroad as a string of safe houses, oftentimes that's the way it's characterized in newspaper accounts. But we find that there were so many different aspects of the Underground Railroad movement, and it's probably better characterized as a movement. There were churches of all sorts that were involved.
There were other aspects, and I would ask you to think for a moment of what characterizes a movement. And from the perspective of our research, what we found is that these characteristics are definitely present. We had James Viney pictured on the left, the top left, who represents the political forces that were working to abolish the institution of slavery. Bottom left is a picture of Harriet Jacobs, who represents those who put pen to paper, sometimes in the form of narratives, sometimes in the form of newspapers. We have an image of John Brown on the bottom right, perhaps not necessarily recognizable in light of the standard image that tends to be selected and portrayed, but this is John Brown, who, like Nat Turner, who preceded John Brown, these were men who believed in an immediate abolition of the institution of slavery, that it needed to happen yesterday. And so for them, taking up arms was a reasonable response. You have the image of the Great Liberty Convention pictured in the center, representing those public gatherings of Black men at the Colored Men's Conventions, which were significant in terms of drawing men together from a variety of communities to address issues that were being faced in terms of the institution of slavery, but also in terms of the other civil rights issues that are still, as we know, with us today. And then the image of the music, the sheet of music on the bottom right, it represents the body of music that was developed during this time period by our anti-slavery supporters. As you know, it's common for movements to have a body of music that is used for educational purposes, that sort of draws at people's heartstrings, motivates people to be active, and so that's how this music was used. And if I could just quickly give you an example, it was common practice for the abolitionists to, sometimes they would draw on songs that were being sung by the enslaved. Other times they would take melodies of the day, songs that people knew, but they would change the lyrics. So what you're looking at right here is actually My Country. Apparently it was previously
originally it was God Save the King, then it was America, then it was My Country.
And so that particular song, while the melody would be retained, the lyrics were changed. So we go from My Country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, for thee I sing, to My Country, 'tis of thee, dark land of slavery, for thee I weep. Land where the slave has sighed, where he has toiled and died, to serve a tyrant's pride, for thee I weep. And it goes on from there. So these are elements that are part and parcel of the Underground Railroad. And so from that perspective, we suggest that we consider the Underground Railroad as a movement, in its broader context.
Yeah, the role of African Americans, I think, is very important in terms of securing freedom, not merely as the passengers on the Underground Railroad. And as I mentioned, we do have a list of about 130 individuals who came through the region, but as the leadership people who were involved in providing the safe havens, places of sanctuary along the way. Stephen Myers is one such individual born in this region in Rensselaer County, what is today Rensselaer County, at Hoosick. He was set free at the age of 18. He did a variety of different kinds of work, including working on steamships in the Hudson River as a steward, providing hospitality for the passengers, as well as in his free time, as it were, working on other projects such as publishing in newspapers such as the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate, the Telegraph and Temperance Journal, and a few others along the way.
Other things like working on an active member of the New York Suffrage Association, the American Council of Colored Laborers, establishing an economic development program in central New York State called the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. And he was also
recruited soldiers for the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War.
And he also took the Albany Public School District to court to attempt to desegregate the school district. So just
busy
a
guy.
things.
The Albany Committee of Vigilance has the reputation of being the most efficient organization in the state of New York in the business of aiding the wayworn and weather-beaten fugitive from slavery shambles. That's a quote from David Ruggles around 1844.
Yeah,
so
it was in the Liberator. David Ruggles was a prominent Black New York City abolitionist.
Henry Highland Garnett, we promised we talked about him, and once again we mentioned his back up. He was brought out of slavery in Maryland by his father in 1824. His family had committed to go to a funeral and had to seek permission from the enslaver to go to this funeral. They did get the permission. And of course, once they got on the road, they just kept going. So they wound up in New Jersey, eventually in New York City. Henry went to the African Free School in New York City. Later on, he went to the Manual Labor School in Whitesboro, New York, and where the young men studied for the ministry. He was called to a pastorate in Troy, New York, at the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church. And let's see, so he really did a variety of different things. Very active in the Underground Railroad, also involved in publishing a newspaper called the Clarion, I think it was, in Troy. At the end of his life, he wound up being sent as a representative for the United States to Liberia, but he was also president of Avery College before that. So quite interesting, a guy who goes from being enslaved to being a president of a college. So an exciting life.
Women's participation has been difficult to uncover. I often like to tease and say the women were so busy doing the work of the Underground Railroad that they did not write about themselves like the men did. Yeah. But nonetheless, they were still very active, frequently using their sewing circles and knitting circles as an opportunity to both produce goods that could be sold at bazaars, with funds raised through the bazaars to support the needs of freedom seekers and to support the needs of the newspapers, that the men were very prolific in publishing, but not always so in terms of fundraising, funding. So, but nonetheless, the women were very active. And this is just a list of a few local women from the capital region who were engaged in their activism.
Civil disobedience and resistance. Obviously, escaping from enslavement was a form of resistance. We, were reminded of Frederick Douglass's comment that people who escaped from slavery were stealing themselves, stealing their labor, and therefore were criminals and breaking laws. But of course, that does raise the question of who owns one's labor. There were a number of newspapers that talked about the various issues from that time period, some dramatic events such as the Jerry Rescue in the early 1850s, the rescue of Charles Knoll in 1860. But these, of course, were in a sense brought about by the Fugitive Slave Laws of 1793 and 1850. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 provided for fines and jail time for people who were helping folks escape from enslavement. And the law of 1850 added a new wrinkle because it bypassed local courts and judges and magistrates by placing U.S. commissioners in many major cities who were supposed to adjudicate these fugitive slave law cases. Plus, if they found people, I'm trying to remember the dollar amount, if they found people guilty of being fugitives from enslavement, they got $15 for that. And if they found people innocent, they got $5 for that. They claimed it was more paperwork if they found someone guilty, but there was a financial incentive there, lopsided justice. So those were some of the things that people had to contend with.
And one of the issues related to the fugitive slave laws is that it encouraged the what we sometimes call slave catching or bounty hunting, which developed into a rather lucrative business over time. And one of the impacts of that situation was that people of color, whether free or freedom seeker, were at great risk, because bounty hunters were very interested in not returning back home empty-handed, because then they wouldn't get paid. And so in order to ensure that they were able to receive the financial compensation they were looking forward to, they would it was not unheard of that they would pursue and apprehend individuals who were not the individuals they were pursuing, but yet sufficiently fit the description that they were able to take someone back. Yeah. So even someone like Stephen Myers, as a Black man, was at risk. So the time period was quite risky for all individuals of African descent.
So language and how we remember the story is important. And so
yes, I do. The standard retelling routinely uses terms such as slave, fugitive or runaway, master or owner, and slavery. And the choice of words that we use, as I'm sure you're aware, comes out of a certain perspective, a certain way of interpreting things in the world, and language is powerful. And I would ask you to think about that in terms of yourself. If think of a word or a phrase which, if directed at you, would lift you up, make you feel like you could take on the world and conquer the day, or a phrase or a word, if directed at you, could generate angry feelings and perhaps generates a sense of depression and unworthiness and so on. So language is very powerful. And so as we're working our way through these historic documents, certainly as you noticed in Harriet's letter, the term fugitive is used. In the Vigilance Committee flyer, the term fugitive is used as well. So, honoring the integrity of the language used in historic documents is certainly necessary. But when we talk about this history among ourselves and share it with generations to follow, we might like to consider that a person who routinely is identified as a slave is not a slave by virtue of their humanity. They are a human being by virtue of their humanity. They are enslaved. They are brought into a situation that holds them in bondage. People who are fugitives, that's clearly they are breaking laws of the day, but they are also freedom seekers. They are exerting self-agency with all its concomitant consequences to achieve a life of freedom to which they believe they were entitled. Master and owner gives weight to the role held by people in that position. Perhaps we can consider acknowledging who they really were, which is enslavers. And when we talk about slavery as if it's something that just sort of happened, it really is an institution when we recognize that it had legal supports, political supports, social supports, and economic supports, the four legs that would support an institution and allow it both to take root and continue and grow. So something for consideration in how we think about and talk about this story in the American narrative.
So some of the central figures, of course, of the story of the Underground Railroad are the people who were the travelers of the Underground Railroad, the freedom seekers. There's a couple of stories that we'd like to share with you. Moses Viney, who we mentioned earlier, was an individual who escaped from enslavement in the early 1840s. He traveled up into the city of Troy and then Albany, and then finally settling in Schenectady. Around 1850, he fled to Canada, and his friends raised funds to purchase his freedom, and then he returned in the late 1850s. He continued to function in the city of Schenectady as a driver and messenger for Eliphalet Knott, who was the president of Union College and of RPI in Troy. And Dr. Knott, when he passed away, left Moses some funds that Moses used to invest in a coach that he could operate on his own, and he operated his own coach taxi service throughout the rest of his life. He lived into the 20th century, so not so very long ago, in a manner of speaking, it was the 21st century.
Harriet Jacobs, for those of you, if you would,
Go ahead.
As we mentioned earlier, she worked with Lydia Marie Child to publish her narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I would encourage you to take the opportunity to read through that. It does have its own challenges because of the Victorian strategies for being somewhat discreet in referring to certain aspects of Harriet's lived experience, but it's a very rich read coming from her voice and her experience. She did, as an adult, escape enslavement in 1842. I do apologize. This says Charleston, South Carolina. It was actually Edenton, North Carolina. One of the distinguishing features of her experience was that when she escaped enslavement, she did not leave the area immediately. She remained hidden in the crawl space in a shed of her grandmother's free grandmother's property, which was adjacent to the property she was being held in and enslaved. Her health was severely compromised across those 7 years, but she chose that strategy because she wanted to arrange for the sale of her own children to an enslaver in the community who she believed would take better care of her children than the man who enslaved her and her children. And she made this choice because she felt unable to take her children with her. Certainly for those, just to think about having to make that decision as a parent is rather mind-boggling and heart-rending. She did make her way through the city of Albany. She she was able to, obtain and live out her life in freedom. Her later life, or sort of her post-escape life, if you will, is very well documented by Jean Fagan Yellen as she continued to research Harriet's life after Harriet had escaped her conditions of enslavement. So definitely, read well worth digging into to learn more about Harriet's life and circumstances.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I think all of these books that we've mentioned, you can get at your local public library. And if they don't have them, they'll get them. And of course, there are connections of this past to the present. When we think about the origins of our criminal justice system and how it's come through the years, you can see this idea of mass incarceration in our recent time in relation to the drug laws, which is very articulated very well in the book, The New Jim Crow. Also, Slavery by Another Name by Doug Blackman, who explains how slavery was transformed at the end of the Civil War, just before the Civil War, was beginning to be transformed into an industrial enterprise rather than an agricultural enterprise. And that the people who were enslaved after the Civil War, when people had their freedom, were very quickly marshaled into the Jim Crow system, and where people were arrested for petty crimes, put in penitentiary, and then from the penitentiary they were rented out to private businesses and industrial businesses. And this practice went on right up into the 1940s. So when we think about, the kind of the situation of the South and the Jim Crow South, again, that kind of renting of convicts went on into the 1940s. The other aspects of Jim Crow in the 1950s and early 60s, and then they began to be challenged by the civil rights movement. The book, The Color.
What I'd like to add too is something that we said early on about the pro-slavery posture of New York State, in that even though New York State abolished the institution of slavery in 1827, there was still a very significant pro-slavery sentiment alive and well in New York State because of its continuing economic connections through insurance industry and food production and clothing production and boat building and so on, transportation. these were things that connected New York State to southern enslaving states. And so there was, just as there was a long-standing pro-slavery sentiment before the Civil War, this kind of sentiment continued over, though it was somewhat transformed, as Paul mentioned, but it continued over after the Civil War.
And people who were part of that Jim Crow system of belief, whites who were in part of that Jim Crow system of belief, came into the federal government under President Woodrow Wilson and actually segregated sections of the federal government that prior to that time had been integrated. And then those people stayed in the federal government, in the bureaucracy over the next decade and into the FDR administration even. And they used things such as federal housing law in order to create segregation in many parts of the country where it had not previously existed. So when you look around here, even in Albany, Schenectady, Troy, Hudson, wherever, and you see portions of the city that appear to be segregated, they were not segregated accidentally. They were segregated intentionally by these federal laws and the manipulation of federal laws in terms of mortgages and financing availability and tools such as those, which forced cities in the North and West to segregate.
And Richard Rothstein lays out this in great detail and very user-friendly fashion in The Color of Law.
Yeah, the Elizabeth Warren is pictured there because she was speaking against Jeff Sessions being nominated for the Attorney General's office under the previous administration. And when he was being nominated and they were going through the process to vote, she was getting ready to read a letter that had been very effectively used against Jeff Sessions in his Senate campaign in Alabama. And the letter was from Coretta Scott King. And when she got up to read the letter, one of the senators jumped up and said, "You can't read the letter. Senate Rule 19, you can't read the letter." And so what was that Senate Rule 19? Well, it was a rule that was put in place in the 1830s to prevent senators from personally attacking each other. It was one of the gag rules from the 1830s when they set aside most of the petitions who were coming into Congress against slavery and said, we're not going to talk about him. So this rule continued as part of the Senate's rules, and there we are, in this century, in this time, and this law from the 1830s is haunting us.
Mm-hmm. Something else we wanted to share with you, as Brenda mentioned when she introduced us, was ways in which Underground Railroad Education Center has strategized to provide opportunities to share this inspiring, empowering story with the community and to create interactive experiences that can help to both change the understanding of the Underground Railroad movement, but also, carry it forward as we move throughout our own spaces and places and times. And so the images here, as Paul mentioned earlier, the building in the center is the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, to which we would invite you all to come pay a visit, and we can share further in some of the aspects of this story. Then the top left is a representative of the Young Abolitionist Leadership Institute that we have been running now for 10, 11 years, and have recently received a large grant that allows us to expand this program from 5 weeks in the summer to a year-round program. And it provides an opportunity for our local teens to both engage with the history and to relate that history to their contemporary lives today. Bottom left is an image of a program that's sort of a signature program of Underground Railroad Education Center, and it represents the July 4th oration, which we hold every year, although this year, I should say last year, we did it virtually. And it is an opportunity for us to gather together and use Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the Slave is Your 4th of July," as the framework for a contemporary analysis of contemporary issues and their relationship, again, to the past. Bottom right is an image representing the annual conference that Underground Railroad Education Center organizes. This year we are virtual, so if you're interested, I would encourage you to check out the organization's website. Look for LibertyCon 2021, and there's details about how we've set up the conference this year. But again, it becomes an opportunity for the public to gather together with researchers and scholars, historians and preservationists, to take a deeper dive into elements of this history, to learn more, to be enriched, and again, to preserve and carry on the story. And then if we can go to the next slide. The top left represents the beginnings of multiple gardens that have developed around the Stephen and Harriet Myers Residence Campus. And all of the gardens, we are proud to say, have been begun by teens. They are continuing to be maintained by other volunteers. But for the teens, the gardens became a way of paying tribute to our local abolitionists, as the gardens are placed on properties where our abolitionists lived. And it becomes a way also organizationally for us to create welcoming green spaces for our neighbors. So it's been a real positive benefit in many ways. Top right is a great fun experience we have every year on International Archaeology Day in the month of October. And this particular image represents the digging in the dirt. And we get down and get dirty, but we unearth some tremendous artifacts along the way that helps to fill out our understanding of the lives of our abolitionists, and also helps us touch history in ways that the historic documents cannot do. So it's a great contribution to developing the story and understanding more fully. Bottom right is representative of the enormous number of volunteers who have stepped up to the plate to contribute their time, their talents, to help Underground Railroad Education Center achieve the many things it has been able to achieve over time. And then bottom left is an image of our teens and preteens who desire to keep the story alive by dressing up in period costume and participating in public events in various ways. So it's been quite a journey, and we certainly would invite you to join with us too. And there's always room for not only more people, but also other ways to engage with helping to share the story and preserve it.
So once again, the key ways that we've been able to understand the Underground Railroad better, in terms of it being a document-based story, the real stories being more interesting than the myths. The public side, the movement, Underground Railroad is a movement, the role of African Americans in leadership roles and resistance and civil disobedience, language and public memory, and of course the connection of the past to the present in so many ways. It's our hope that the time spent today has provided an opportunity to better understand about an important time in our region's history and heritage.
The example of the people we have talked about, both the freedom seekers and those who helped them in their flight to freedom, was one of principle, decision, and justice.
We hope that their example as people of courage, people of hope, seekers of justice will be for us, as the North Star was for them, a guiding light to show the way to our own freedom. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to the library for hosting us. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to entertain them.
Can we put that down? There we go. There we go.
So thank you so much. This was such a rich history, and I'm so glad to have it be from this area. It's very exciting. Anyone who has questions can write them to me in the chat box. We have over 100 people that are attending, so I don't think we could just start shouting out questions.
I would, if I may say, Brenda, it also is possible, if anybody's like me, I tend to think about questions after I've left, whatever I'm attending. So if anyone is like me, there is the contact us page on the Underground Railroad Education Center website, which is an excellent tool for staying in touch.
The website is undergroundrailroadhistory.org.
Okay, great. Thank you. Undergroundrailroadhistory.org. And I'm getting lots of thank yous, and this was terrific. Messages like that. So if anyone has questions, to begin with, since I don't see a question yet, I do have a question, especially because, being from the city of Hudson here, we're right on the river, and we were a whaling town and a shipping town. So what role did the river play? And also, my understanding was that a lot of the ships, this was an industry that actually African Americans could enter and they could be promoted. There was even there were even captains sometimes, especially the whaling industry,
Yeah.
because it was so dangerous. So just any information on those two questions, the past using the Hudson River.
Sure. Yeah, the river was a common means of transportation, you know, but before there were railroads, before there was Interstate 87, there was the Hudson River. And Stephen Myers worked on some of the steamboats that operated on the Hudson River, going up and down, the dayliners that went between New York City and Albany. He worked as a steward on the ships. What was the name of the ship he was on? The Armenia. Which was one of the fastest ships on the Hudson River. This would have been in the late 1840s, I think, early 1850s. But also, and when he was involved with the Armenia was definitely a ship that was utilized in transporting people from New York City to Albany. Interestingly, as well. Stephen and Harriet lived in the building that we showed you, which was owned by John Johnson, who was Harriet's brother. John Johnson and Abram Johnson in around 1833, 1834, purchased a sloop and became sloop operators on the Hudson River. Now, if you're familiar with the sloops, single-masted sailing ship that was commonly used, actually patterned after some of the Dutch canal boats, but with a sail, and used for transporting materials and livestock and lumber and sometimes people as well up and down the Hudson River. So there were probably hundreds of sloops that operated up and down the Hudson River in the 18-teens, 20s, 30s. In the 1840s, they began to be overtaken by these steamships, and eventually the steamships were the dominant ship on the river. But they played an important role, and the Johnsons, we believe, were also involved in occasionally transporting people from New York City to Albany, and all of the ports along the river had boats that were based out of them. So Catskill, Athens, going right down the river, and no doubt Hudson as well.
The other piece to add to that, at least from our perspective here in Albany, is that there are records indicating that by 1850, the Port of Albany, which nowadays is home to the Slater, which is a historic preserved ship, that Port of Albany was able to dock 50 steamboats and 1,000 canal boats at one time. So right. Clearly, very significant. The Hudson River, it was clearly a very significant part of the lifeways of people in this time period. And I know for us here in Albany, it's difficult to appreciate because we have 787. Separating us from the river. Now, luckily, there is some conversation, at least luckily from my perspective, there is some current conversation among state legislators about redesigning this highway. So I'm hoping that things will take place such that we can have closer connections with the river, which has such an important historic connection to the development of our communities.
I also mentioned there were some stories from the 1830s, which I thought were kind of interesting, which I had garnered from some of the older newspapers as we're kind of hunting through them, about people being kidnapped off of the docks. And this particular story that I read was that there was a ship known to be a southern originating ship. And this ship was presumably involved in kidnapping people off the docks in order to take them south and sell them. And so that was quite an interesting story.
Wow. I have a lot of questions now. Is there an earliest date that you've investigated or documented in colonial Albany history? How far back have you gone?
Well, usually most of our time we spend in the 1850s, 1840s, 1830s. So after 1827, when New York was a slave state until 1827, and it abolished slavery officially by July 4th, 1827. So, but we are aware that what's considered to be the story of the Underground Railroad stretches back as far as George Washington. There's a story that where he complained about an organized group out of Philadelphia helping a couple of people from his plantation to escape. So we sort of consider it to stretch back that far.
That's great.
Not farther.
And someone writes, thank you for your work and devotion. Do you see links between freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad and those involved in the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, the long part of that is that there's a kind of, we sort of view it as a kind of, the African American freedom struggle, and the Black Lives Matter movement is the current manifestation of that, in terms of trying to regain, in order to gain equality before the law. It continues to be an issue. You know, everybody. I think there was a lot of public anger about the George Floyd killing in Minnesota, and the feeling that, you know, enough's enough, you know, and that was followed by Breonna Taylor, and there were others, and even just recently there have been a couple of people. So the issue of how police handle arrests, you know, how they handle the work that they do, how careful they are about who they admit into that role of authority, you know, carrying a gun. These are all continuing issues, and I think it's all part of the same continuing story.
Here's another question. Was the Underground Railroad active in the rural farming areas, such as Eastern Columbia County? So going away from the river.
Right. That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess I don't think I have a good answer to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I do either.
It would seem that, generally speaking, the answer would be yes. But what I'm struggling with is the data. I don't have names or counts to draw on to support that. Trying to think, and I'm going to ask, I saw, if I may, I think Judy Wellman signed in earlier, and if Judy is in attendance, if she might have any thoughts in reference to that particular question.
Yeah, she's here, so I'll ask her to unmute.
Okay.
Okay, whoops. I think I muted her again. All right.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Mary Liz. I was thinking about that too. I don't have any specific notes about that area, except for a little community called Sand Lake. And Abel Brown was very active in that area too. Yeah. And I'm working on a project right now with other people on the Underground Road in Oneida County. And we found examples from, excuse me, the mid 18th century of people escaping from slavery. So we're counting them as part of the National Park Service now defines the Underground Railroad as the escape of people from slavery, focusing on enslaved people rather than on the safe houses that the traditional story is. So we're looking at even in 18th century areas, and I imagine that's probably true for Albany. So we've been finding things like advertisements for people who've run away from so-and-so. So that's an escape site. And, and the person probably went to a family member next door. And just because that wasn't a white person doesn't mean they weren't part of a network of escape to freedom.
Yeah, that tier of counties that runs up the eastern side of the river, I mean, there are various things at different points. The Nine Partners group, which is a Quaker focused community. And, you know, then you're skipping a few counties, maybe. There was the story of, I'm trying to think, there was a a story about a person in who stayed with the Williamses, I think, or maybe the person's name was Williams, who in Columbia County.
Oh.
She worked. The folks worked as housekeepers for those folks. I'd have to look and find out. But
Hudson was a real area of Quaker activism, and Nine Partners Boarding School was a real hot spot. And Charles Marriott was down there.
Yeah,
also.
Charles Marriott. They worked for Charles Marriott. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
So,
because
This was
I'm sorry.
beautifully done, Paul and Mary Liz, and I love your focus on the story as it's carried forward and with contemporary issues relating to these too. I mean, it's so important.
Yeah.
That's why we're all in it, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Judy Wellman is a retired professor of history from SUNY Oswego.
Oswego.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And an author of several books on women's activism
And a principal with Historical New York, and an incredible researcher, and just a wealth of knowledge and experience.
So back at you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned
Mutual Admiration Society. It's a wonderful field to be working in right now, because people are so committed and so aware of the connections with present issues and so helpful to each other. So thank you, Paul and Mary Liz.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, so we have about 10 minutes or so I'll try to get through to the questions. But Charles Marriott, I found information that he actually lived in the Van Hosen house with his sister, which is a Dutch house that's out on Route 66. It's about literally 5 minutes from the library. So we're trying to find more information about, his work. We understand that he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but and he lived there at least a few years before the Civil War. He was in that house. Yeah. And they're restoring that house. So it's, it's a lot of interesting connections.
Yeah.
So the next question, did the Myers face specific dangers since they were so public with their role about helping freedom seekers?
What we have found is that they were public enough. It figures that the risk to them personally was actually lower than if they were less public. Their public, the awareness of them, in the public arena was supported by local abolitionists of some standing in the community. For instance, Thurlow Weed, who was the publisher of the Albany Evening Journal, was a supporter of the work that Stephen and Harriet were doing. We have the J family, as referenced in Harriet's letter that was shared at the beginning of the evening, as supporters. There were other philanthropists that were located in New York City, whose names I must admit I have forgotten, but they were also supporters. The recognition of the work of Stephen Myers by David Ruggles in New York City. These are, to us, we read this evidence as suggestive of the lack of risk to Stephen and Harriet, simply because of their, as I say, their public presence, as recognized in the community.
On the other hand, there was occasionally. We did run across some snarky comments in one of the newspapers about Stephen and his work. There he is parading through the streets again with a bunch of fugitives from slavery. And also,
wasn't he accused of a theft?
He was accused of a theft of a watch by somebody who claimed to be a freedom seeker or was a freedom seeker, and
it had no basis.
He had no
in
basis.
Fact, so.
There were also some other controversies, like, for instance, with the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. That's not so much tied in with his in the sense of the work of people stalking him, but maybe, stoking a little dissension. The controversy with the Florence Farming and Lumber Association was that initially they were starting this land project near Utica in a place called Florence, where they were buying land. They had gotten land on favorable terms from Garrett Smith, the large land owner in the state, and they were hoping to divide the area up into small lots that people could buy, and then they would farm in common, in a model similar to what was being used in Canada. But in the United States, the prevailing thinking was that a person would need 40 acres to be able to survive as an independent farmer. And Myers was selling quarter-acre lots to people. And so the discussion turned from this wonderful thing that was going to be taking place with blacks getting land and getting out into agriculture, and it turned from that to being, what kind of a scam are you pulling?
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So and then before that could fully play out, the federal fugitive slave law passed, and that fugitive slave law of 1850 got a lot of people very scared. Myers had talked about as many as 600 people coming from across New England to settle at the Florence location, but the whole thing evaporated away, and that was a controversy, and there were a couple of other controversies, but.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions. Maybe we'll try to get to a few more at least. Someone lives in Catskill and is interested to know about the Underground Railroad activity in Greene County. Has there been much research, and is there much information available?
Greene County.
That's like Catskill, Cairo. Yeah. Maybe you know that.
Yeah, there is a group down I think it's not Catskill Mountain. Catskill Mountain Historical Society, I think it is. They're doing some research on African Americans in that region. I believe they do have some stories, but nothing conspicuous jumps out in my mind right now about Greene County.
Okay, and someone is asking, are there homes in Columbia County that are known to be used by the freedom seekers?
Besides the story, the Charles Marriott story that I was talking about, and Martin Cross, who I mentioned, who we haven't done a lot of research on, I wouldn't be able to say. However, one thing that I would be quick to say is that, actually two things I'd be quick to say. One is, people have figured that as many possibly as 100,000 people, escaped from enslavement and made their way across the country. Now, granted, they were going in a lot of different directions, but that does give you the promise of a lot of people crossing the country essentially on foot, across the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, but they'd be stopping a lot of places. So there's that. The other thing is that it's very frequent that people like to think or recall that this or that place might have been a connection with the Underground Railroad. Sometimes they find, secret rooms or false basements or whatever in their homes. They say, "Oh, this must be from the Underground Railroad," and in some cases, those things have no connection whatsoever. They need to be screened in terms of our thinking, our retrospective thinking. And Judy Wellman does have what we've all been calling the Wellman scale, which is evaluating those locations. Oftentimes people will find that, like there's a place in Western New York that people thought had something to do with the Underground Railroad. It turns out it seems like it had more to do with the War of 1812. When the British were burning everything left and right, and so people needed places to hide, and others situations that are more connected with other great traditions of American hiding, like the Prohibition.
Yes.
So
Yes, there's always that. There's a couple comments. I appreciated the change in language suggested, which truly brings out the reality of how the institution of slavery affects us all. And someone else wrote, well done. So much Underground Railroad history between New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And that's from Gail from West Hartford, Connecticut. Question.
Gail, there's a book called The Underground Railroad in Connecticut. It's been out of print for a while, but I'm sure you can trace it down on some one of those ABE books or a Libris.
Oh, great. That's
Might be
good.
fun.
And then a question. Do you have any documentation about the role the Erie Canal played in those enslaved seeking freedom? Good question.
Yeah. How about Judy, if you're still there, I'm going to let you answer that one.
Right. I'm going to unmute her.
Okay.
We should never mute Judy anyway. I'm getting
Adam.
Yes, in fact, there was a talk today by a man from the Canal Museum in Syracuse about the canal. And I've also been working some on it because it goes through Oneida County and every place else. And it certainly was used by freedom seekers, and we have some particular stories, some specific stories. It also became a major source of income and occupations for free people, either those who had escaped and settled in New York State or were born in New York State and remained there. So that almost every canal town had barbers, at least one. They were almost all Black, and many of them had escaped from slavery and settled there. So it becomes a really important source of employment and allows freedom seekers and other people of color to stay, as well as being a source of transportation. I think after the New York Central Railroad consolidated several shorter lines in 1853, so that one can get on the train in New York City, go up to Albany and west to Niagara Falls and right over the new suspension bridge, that begins to become more important than the canal, certainly in carrying freedom seekers. But there are a lot of examples, enough to know that it was a major route.
Yeah, the Vigilance Committee flyer that we referred to makes a reference to people paying for passage, which we have long assumed meant passage on canal boats. The other thing is Moses Roper, who wrote his story of his escape from enslavement and his journeys, works on the canal for a period of time. He comes to Albany and he gets work on the canal. So
that's Solomon Northrop. He works on the Champlain Canal. Thomas James escapes from slavery in 1821 in Montgomery County by following the line of the canal west. So there are lots of examples. So yeah.
Okay, great. And next question, in terms of public transport, were steamships and water transport used more frequently by the Underground Railroad than trains?
It depends on where you're going. If you're traveling across lots, like from Albany west, no, that became partly canal, partly
train.
Yeah, trains, largely trains actually by the 1850s, I think, but also the just overland wagons and so forth. But one of the destinations of the trains and the canals and the wagons was always a port, and it would be Oswego or Pulteneyville or Rochester or Lewiston or Niagara Falls from except for Niagara Falls, where they'd go over, either being rowed over the river right at the base of the falls by waiters from the Cataract House, who were almost all Black, or after the suspension bridge was finished via the suspension bridge and the train. But all those other ports, they would have gone to steamboats. So there's lots of examples of, we know the names of steamboat operators who would say, I'll take anybody who needs to go across, I'll take you across. And they were specifically kind of known to be sympathetic to freedom seekers and to encourage them to come.
This next question, just got covered a little bit, at least. What route did freedom seekers take to Albany to Canada from Albany?
Well, Albany was a central hub sort of place, and people were going there. There's documents showing people travel east. They would go, up out of Albany into Troy and east, or they would go up the Champlain Canal, or they would go west on the Hudson, west on the Erie, and either go up to Oswego or go further west to Syracuse and Rochester and Buffalo. So people were kind of going in all directions.
Okay. Thank you for sharing your work this way. How many locations in New York State served as a safe house? How have these homes been verified as having this history? And did these homeowners stay in touch with other New York State homeowners as they worked in the movement?
The first one, yes. The second one, no. I don't know that we know a number. There are 28 sites that are part of the Underground Railroad New York State Consortium, Underground Railroad Consortium. There are, Judy may have a take on this, which from her studies. I would imagine there's sort of like a core of places that folks know about. There's a number of places that are in doubt. This idea of the Wellman scale, which kind of ranks, there's been an effort to vet these sites because so many people would make claims, and sometimes the claims wouldn't be true or wouldn't be verifiable. So this idea of a scale, is it mentioned in abolitionist literature? Is it a known site? Is it just simply something that's associated in some way, shape, or form? I bet Judy could tell me the Wellman scale better than I could. But
I was going to say open it to Judy.
Yeah. Judy, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting scale, because the idea is that the research is ongoing and we just don't know.
Yeah.
And there are so many stories that we don't have the evidence for. It doesn't mean we won't find it. So the idea is don't throw anything out until you're absolutely sure.
Yeah.
So it goes from 1 to 5, and 1 is we know from documented evidence that it wasn't nobody there was helping somebody. The story of Fort Ontario, you might have heard me tell before, but I used to teach local history in Oswego, and every student in every class would say, oh yeah, that was the big Underground Railroad site because there's big tunnels under there. And finally one student said, you know why they're always saying that? It's because, and I'd say, well, why would a freedom seeker go to a federal fort especially after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed? I don't think so. And finally a student said, well, it's because every kid in the 3rd grade gets a tour of the fort, and the docent there always says it was an Underground Railroad site, so kids run around and get excited. Oh, so it's a number 1. Nobody's going to Fort Ontario. But and then it goes up to 5 with primary source evidence by the person actually involved. So that was kind of it. And we have no idea. And our definition of sites is so expanding. So much of it is now African-American homes and business places that really haven't been on our radar because they didn't sign, well, some of them signed anti-slavery petitions, but they didn't organize in the same way that whites did, and abolitionist movements and leave that kind of documented evidence. But we're really beginning to track them. And one of the interesting ways that is really panning out is to look at the census records, the most public records. And I always start these big projects with creating a database of every African-American listed in the census from 1850 to 1870. And then you begin to sort people by places of birth. And a lot of freedom seekers, not a lot, but enough to make that really a red flag. It will tell the birthplace, maybe Maryland, Virginia, whatever. But then the next census, they'll say Westchester County. And if you find that kind of pattern where people are changing their birthplaces, it's almost certainly a person who escaped from slavery. I mean, one guy I remember, he said the West Indies, Spain, South Carolina, and I forgot. And so we're beginning to use those kinds of records to tease out these stories, and they're becoming really, really useful and something you can do from home. And I invite everyone to try it because we really need help.
Yeah, I want to throw in 2 things. One is that people often say this building or that building was part of the Underground Railroad, and I really think that people should start with, by looking at abolitionist and anti-slavery literature and personalities. You find somebody like I don't know, Henry Highland Garnett, for instance, in Troy. Well, where did he live? Where are the places where he lived? Look at those buildings first. The other thing is not to assume that a building necessarily had a hiding place in it, because you did have a sort of a division, if you will. You certainly had some people that probably had houses left over from the War of 1812. Maybe you had some other people, like out in Southern Ohio, where they might have built their house to be confusing, when people came in to look for somebody there. But by and large, many of those folks who were involved in the Underground Railroad are welcoming people into their home and putting them up in an extra room somewhere. J.W. Pennington has a story about how he was met by somebody on the street, and he thought the person was just giving, just trying to be a freeloader, and the guy was asking for a place to stay. But when the fellow betrayed that he had been enslaved, Pennington said, "I have a room for you. It's been set aside for just this purpose." This idea that there's always a secret room, I think, is a mistake. And then the other thing is that there were there were many people who had tried to settle, many blacks who had escaped from enslavement had settled throughout places in the Northeast and New York and other places. And then the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 came in, and a lot of people fled to Canada. And I think that sometimes the perception of some place being a part of the Underground Railroad is more a function of, were black people there, than that it was actually something to do with the Underground Railroad. You do see that with some of the, you get people from time to time coming forward and telling you, oh, such and such a house was involved with the Underground Railroad because there are chains in the basement.
Right.
So it's like, no, I think that was from the Dutch period of slavery, or something like that. Or
right. So again, somebody's asking about Marriott. What do you know about the Hudson abolitionist Charles Marriott? He wrote letters describing sending freedom seekers up to the Vermont farm of Roland Robinson.
Mm-hmm. So what do we know about?
What do we know? That's about as much as we know. Maybe Judy, do you have?
No, I don't have more, but the Vermont farm is open to the public and well documented, has well documented cases. And the Mid-Hudson Valley Underground Railroad Group out of Poughkeepsie is really worth checking out too.
Okay, thank you. Are you able to convey to Judith Wellman that she has a big fan of her book? This is from Lydia. On Weeksville logged in after the discussion, of course. Oh, I wasn't supposed to tell you yet. So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
To the Eastern Columbia County question, you can read about Peter Wheeler, who was a former slave who lived in Spencertown, which is up in the north part of our county, and it's quite east also, and helped by St. Peter's Church. Thank you, Troy. I'm going to write that one down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very interesting and important presentation, and I think we are at the end. So thank you for staying longer, and we really appreciate it. We have a lot of interest, and there's a lot of knowledge that you have. So thank you very, very much, Mary Liz and Paul.
Thank you. It's fun.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Thank you too. Thank you.
It's been fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, a lot of people are writing now. Thank you. So, thank you.